Welcome to the Sleepy Lecture, a quiet space where curiosity meets calm. Here, we explore history, philosophy, science, and the world's most interesting ideas in a slow, gentle way, designed to help you relax, unwind, and drift off to sleep. Whether you're here to learn something new or simply let your mind settle after a long day, you're in the right place. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let tonight's lecture softly carry you into rest. At 2:10 in the afternoon on the 5th of December, 1945, 5 torpedo bombers took off from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale in Florida and flew east over the Atlantic Ocean on a routine training exercise. None of them ever came back. The flight was designated Flight 19, a label as ordinary as the mission itself was supposed to be. The 5 aircraft were TBM Avengers, rugged and proven torpedo bombers that had served throughout the Second World War and were considered among the most reliable naval aircraft of their era. The crews were a mix of experienced pilots and student aviators, 14 men in total, conducting what the Navy called Navigation Problem Number 1, a standard triangular route that student pilots flew repeatedly as part of their training. They were to fly east to a place called Hens and Chickens Shoals near the Bahamas, conduct practice bombing runs, turn north over Grand Bahama Island, and then fly southwest back to Fort Lauderdale. The whole exercise was expected to take around 2 hours and 40 minutes. Tonight, we move through the story of Flight 19 slowly. What happened on that December afternoon? The transmissions that were overheard as the flight grew confused and frightened over the open Atlantic. The search that followed. And the deeper question of how 14 experienced men in 5 reliable aircraft could vanish without leaving a single confirmed trace that has ever been found. The answer involves compass failure, a fatal mistake about location, deteriorating weather, darkness over open ocean, and a chain of misfortunes that compounded each other until there was nothing left to do. It does not involve the Bermuda Triangle, at least not in any supernatural sense. But the true story is strange enough on its own terms that it does not need embellishment. Let your breathing slow, and we begin with the flight leader. Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor was 28 years old on the day Flight 19 disappeared. He was an experienced pilot with over 2,500 flying hours, including combat missions in the Pacific during the war, and he had flown the TBM Avenger for more than 600 of those hours. By the standards of the time, he was well qualified to lead a training flight over familiar waters. He was also, as the subsequent investigation would establish, a man who had a history of navigational difficulty. He had become lost on 3 separate occasions during the war, twice ditching his aircraft in the ocean and requiring rescue. He was not at NAS Fort Lauderdale regularly and did not know the local geography well. And on the morning of December 5th, he had apparently asked a colleague to take over the flight leadership without giving a clear reason, and the colleague had declined. The flight completed the first leg of its exercise without incident. The bombing runs at Hens and Chickens Shoals were carried out as scheduled. Then, turning north toward Grand Bahama Island to complete the second leg, something went wrong. At around 3:45 in the afternoon, a flight instructor named Lieutenant Robert Cox, who was flying nearby on an unrelated training exercise, picked up a radio transmission from an unidentified aircraft in which one pilot was asking another for a compass reading. The response he heard was the first indication that something was seriously wrong. The voice said, "I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn." Cox called back, asking for identification, and eventually made contact with Taylor, who told him something that puzzled Cox immediately. Taylor said that both of his compasses had stopped working, that he was over land but could not identify it, and that he believed he was somewhere in the Florida Keys, the chain of islands that run southwest from Miami into the Gulf of Mexico. Cox, who could see the Florida coastline from his own aircraft, was confused by this claim, because the Keys were in entirely the wrong direction from where Flight 19 should have been at that point in its exercise. He gave Taylor instructions for returning from the Keys to Fort Lauderdale, and Taylor appeared to follow them, but the flight did not appear over the coast. The problem was that Taylor was wrong about his location in a way that proved impossible to correct in the time remaining. He had, in fact, flown over the Bahamas as scheduled, but something, possibly the compass failure, possibly the absence of recognizable landmarks, possibly some combination of stress and uncertainty, had convinced him that the islands he was passing over were the Florida Keys, rather than the Bahamas. The two archipelagos are separated by several hundred miles and lie in completely different directions from Fort Lauderdale. But from the air, over unfamiliar terrain, the confusion is at least understandable. Acting on his belief that he was in the Keys and over the Gulf of Mexico, Taylor directed his flight northeast, which he believed would take them over Florida and back toward the base. In reality, flying northeast from the Bahamas took the flight further out over the open Atlantic Ocean with every passing minute. Some of the other pilots appear to have understood this. Radio transmissions intercepted at Fort Lauderdale included one in which a trainee pilot was heard to say that if they flew west, they would get home. Taylor refused to turn west, insisting that his assessment of their position was correct. Naval discipline required the other pilots to follow their flight leader's orders, and they did. Though the transmissions show that at least some of them were deeply uncertain about the decision. One voice, recorded by ground stations listening to the frequency, said simply, "Damn it. If we would just fly west, we would get home." Taylor held the northeast heading. Meanwhile, ground stations at Fort Lauderdale were picking up enough radio traffic from Flight 19 to attempt radio direction triangulation, a technique that uses the bearing of a signal from multiple stations to estimate the transmitter's position. By around 5:50 in the afternoon, triangulation placed Flight 19 somewhere north of the Bahamas and well out over the Atlantic Ocean, significantly further east than Taylor believed they were. This information was not successfully communicated to Taylor before the situation became irretrievable. As the afternoon turned to evening, the weather that had been merely uncertain became actively dangerous. A weather front was moving in from the north, bringing squalls, high winds, and rough seas. By the time the sun set at around 5:30, the five Avengers were over dark ocean in deteriorating conditions with no visual reference, no functioning compasses on the lead aircraft, and fuel that was draining steadily with every mile they flew in the wrong direction. The radio transmissions that ground stations continued to receive became increasingly distressing in their content. At some point, Taylor turned over command of the flight to another pilot for reasons that were never fully established. The new leader's voice, when it was heard on the frequency, was described by those listening as trembling, bordering on hysteria. The transmission recorded by the Naval History and Heritage Command describes that final period in the most direct terms available. "We can't find west," a voice said. "Everything is wrong. We can't be sure of any direction. Everything looks strange, even the ocean." After a further period of silence, another transmission came through. "We can't tell where we are. Everything is wrong. We think we may be about 225 miles northeast of base." Then, in the last transmission ever received from Flight 19, a voice said, "It looks like we are entering white water. We're completely lost." Taylor's last transmission was logged at 6:20 in the evening. He was heard to say, "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. After that, silence." The 5 Avengers ditched somewhere in the Atlantic after dark, in rough seas and high winds. The TBM Avenger was known to sink rapidly when it hit the water, typically within 60 seconds of impact. In those conditions in darkness, that was almost certainly not survivable. The search launched the following morning was one of the largest in American naval history to that point, involving over 300 aircraft per day and covering more than 300,000 square miles of ocean over 5 days. It found nothing confirmed. Reported flares and life rafts and debris, each one a brief moment of hope, turned out to be other vessels, or natural phenomena, or simply mistakes made by searchers straining in bad light to see something in empty water. The search was eventually called off, and all 14 men of Flight 19 were declared lost at sea. The disappearance of Flight 19 was compounded that same night by the loss of a search aircraft sent out to find them. A Martin PBM Mariner flying boat with 13 men aboard took off from Naval Air Station Banana River around 7:30 in the evening, 20 minutes after which it suddenly dropped off radio contact. A ship in the area reported seeing a burst of flames in the sky around that time, estimated to be 100 feet tall, consistent with a catastrophic in-flight explosion. The Mariner was known among crews as a flying gas tank due to its very high fuel capacity and its tendency to accumulate explosive fuel vapors. Its wreckage and crew were never found either, bringing the total lost that day to 27 men across 6 aircraft. In a single December afternoon and evening, 6 aircraft and 27 people disappeared from the skies above the Western Atlantic, and no confirmed trace of any of them has ever been recovered in more than 75 years of subsequent searching. The official investigation reached a conclusion that satisfied almost no one and was subsequently amended in a way that raises its own questions. The initial finding was that Lieutenant Taylor had made a navigational error, mistaking the Bahamas for the Florida Keys, and had then led the flight in the wrong direction until it ran out of fuel. The report additionally noted that Taylor had refused to switch from the training radio frequency to the emergency rescue frequency, a decision that hampered the ability of ground stations to communicate with him effectively, and had declined to use the emergency homing equipment installed in the aircraft that might have helped guide them toward the coast. Taylor's mother contested the finding, and the Navy subsequently amended the official cause of the loss from Taylor's error to cause unknown. This amendment has been interpreted in various ways by different researchers, some seeing it as a reasonable acknowledgement that the full picture can never be known, others seeing it as the Navy protecting the reputation of one of its officers at the expense of historical clarity. What it means for the record is that Flight 19's disappearance carries the designation cause unknown, which has made it considerably easier for writers and theorists to fill that space with explanations of their own choosing. The Bermuda Triangle, as a named concept, did not exist in 1945. The term was coined in 1964, and the myth was substantially built around Flight 19 and a handful of other cases from the same region. The area is heavily travelled, notoriously difficult to navigate without modern instruments, subject to sudden severe weather, and deep enough that wreckage from a ditched aircraft would almost certainly have sunk beyond the reach of any search effort available at the time. None of that requires a supernatural explanation, though it does require honest acknowledgement that some things lost in open ocean are simply never recovered. The men of Flight 19 are remembered at a memorial at the former Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, now Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport, where a commemorative plaque lists their names. The crews of the Mariner are similarly memorialized at what was once NAS Banana River, now Patrick Space Force Base in Florida. Their names are on record. Their fates are not confirmed in any physical sense, because their aircraft have never been conclusively found, and the Atlantic is deep and the currents are strong, and 75 years is a long time for wreckage to travel. Various claims of discovery have been made over the decades, including a 1992 expedition that located scattered debris on the ocean floor that could not be positively identified, and a 2015 newspaper report of a warplane with Navy markings found in a forest near Sebastian, Florida, that was initially attributed to Flight 19 before the Navy withdrew the claim. Nothing definitive has emerged, and each false lead has added to the strange patina of the case. The sense that this particular disappearance does not want to be found, that the ocean took it completely and intends to keep it. It is late now, and the Atlantic is somewhere to the west of where you are, moving in its slow, enormous rhythms, carrying whatever it carries from that December evening in 1945, in a form no one has ever been able to retrieve. 14 men took off on a routine training flight in the late afternoon, carrying everything ordinary that people carry when they expect to be home for dinner, and flew into a situation that compounded itself, one misfortune at a time, until there was no way out. The compasses failed. The location was misidentified. The heading was wrong. The weather came in. The sun went down. The fuel ran out. And the ocean received them and said nothing. The question of why it all went wrong in exactly the right sequence to prevent any single misfortune from being corrected in time is the question the cause unknown designation leaves permanently open. It may have been a chain of ordinary failures assembled on one afternoon in a particularly fatal order. It may have involved something about Taylor's state that day that was never established. It may simply be that the ocean is large and unforgiving, and sometimes things are lost in it completely. Let the question rest where it rests tonight. Let the Atlantic hold what it holds. They flew east on a clear December afternoon, and the ocean was larger than the fuel. Rest now.